Welcome to this week's episode of the Good Luck Club podcast. My guest today is entrepreneur Daniel Loftus, founder and CEO of UrbanFox. Daniel, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Daniel, I wonder if you could start off by kindly telling my audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, my name is Daniel Loftus. I'm actually based in Dublin, but I'm from the west coast of Ireland. I suppose I've been between different things up to now, but I've been, involved in software engineering and data science probably for the last 10 years or so, and I've eternally locked in different startups, whether it's working for them or co-founding them or founding them outright since college. So I sort of have a little bit of a background in all the sort of nonsense that goes on with startups right now. So that's sort of me in a nutshell.
I always like to ask guests if they could perhaps tell us what success means to them, so that our audience could get a gauge of how you think.
Yeah. So look, I suppose to give the trite answer, it's success obviously means different things to different people, but for me anyway, with UrbanFox, I think a huge part of that at the moment is sort of building a name for the software and for the product that we're building, right? So our software very much sits in the fintech anti-fraud space, so trying to stop fraudsters from doing bad things, and for me anyway, a big part of what success looks like is for us to be known in that space. When banks or merchants or whatever are talking about fraud, that we're at least at some point in the thought process involved, whether that's as knowledge leaders or as technology suppliers or whatever else that might be. So that that's sort of the standard answer, but like realistically there's a part of this that's financially motivated, right? I think very few entrepreneurs are in it just for the good of what they're doing. Like there has to be that financial motivation to put up with years of what is an incredibly tough, lonely and sort of horrible slog through startup life. So it is nice, whether it is reality or not, it is nice to have that sort of light at the end of the tunnel that possibly could be a financial reward, whether it's an exit or whatever. And I think it's sort of a mix between the two, that sort of recognition for the cool technology we're building and that financial motivation as well. That is definitely a driver for me personally anyway.
Well, first of all, I thank you for your honesty, Daniel. I think the financial piece for a lot of people sometimes is skipped over as if it's almost something you shouldn't talk about, wanting a financial reward. But of course, it's always there. Out of interest, do you ever think about what is a financial reward worth the effort?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's sort of an apt question as well, given as I said, I'm based in Ireland. And here there is certainly a reputation that when an exit does come along for a founder, that it is often, a quick exit. So maybe not the amount of reward that should be issued, given the amount of effort that has been put in. I think it's a massively personal thing, right? So some people, once they start getting that sort of momentum behind them, that is either an exit or sort of a financially successful company, obviously they're going to have other things in mind. So whether it's sitting on a beach for the rest of your life or deciding to go into philanthropic endeavors, or indeed using one startup as a leaping off point to another, it's sort of a tough one. Like for a lot of founders, I think they're nearly, at some point or another, they're nearly pressured, for an exit or whatever it might be, when maybe that's not the right thing. Like maybe if they, I think there's some evidence in the US where, basically for every year after, I think, Series A or Series B, the likelihood of a significant multiple of an exit actually increases quite significantly. So is it worth it? Statistically, it's probably not. 90% of all startups fail. And is playing those odds, a logically sound proposition? It's sort of hard to tell, but I suppose those 10% that go on and succeed, well, the reward can be quite great, whether it's financial independence or just a sort of a job well done type of thing. Like, I have built this great company and we employ people, and we sort of people who are involved benefit from the existence of the company or the endeavor or whatever else it might be.
I definitely think it's an interesting area that isn't discussed enough, really, around what is the financial reward to justify the effort. And I think sometimes what happens in my experience, and if you have a similar view, is that people work really hard to build something up, and then often they sell it for less than it's worth because they've got tired, or maybe they're scared of competition, or things have got more competitive in the space they're in, and they're not sure that their business will survive. So that, it does feel to me like a lot of businesses get undervalued at exit.
Yeah, like it's definitely the case. Like, again, I can't claim I'm any expert or anything like that, but there does seem to be nearly fatigue that builds in, even with successful founders. As you said, they might just get to a point where they're like, this basically isn't worth it anymore, so I'm going to take a smaller exit, just so I can, do something new or do something better. I think it is a strange thing, but I suppose a very human thing. We as founders, we tend to get so attached to what we're building, and that can be in and of itself a massive handicap, because you are now sort of tied, like in the worst case scenario, you're tied to this ship that's sinking, or indeed you're sort of tied to this thing that, for the first couple of years it was everything you ever wanted, and now you're realizing, oh crap, like it is just a massive drain, personally and emotionally and whatever else. And it is a strange thing. Like, I do think that founders, and I'm not saying founders in some sort of esoteric sort of tech only sort of way. It's like, whether it's you own a tech company or you own a hardware store or whatever it is, we need to be a bit more dispassionate. I am not my company is not me. We are two separate entities, and I think more founders would benefit a little bit from thinking like that, especially when tough decisions have to be made. 9 times out of 10 those tough decisions are about, should the business actually even continue on. I suppose if you're getting to the point where it's like, well, do I want to exit for a 5x multiple instead of a 10x multiple? Well, that's sort of a good problem to have in a way. But I do think a lot of founders are definitely overly attached to what they're building, from nearly a structural standpoint.
I think it's this area we're talking about here. I do think could be unboxed, and it's really very interesting. I want to capture your story, and I don't want to accidentally get caught into this discussion. But I do see a lot of founders that also their life changes, and they're perhaps, for example, they get a partner or they have a child, or and perhaps running a startup, or the one that they're running isn't any longer in line with their needs in life. And I do think for a lot of people that are thinking I'm thinking about my listeners for a minute. Anyone out there thinking of starting a business, this is something to consider. I do think, for example, I have brought in people to run my company for me in the past when I no longer wanted to run it. Having some succession planning, even if you're young, is a pretty interesting idea. And I also have noticed that if you do get tired and then you try to sell your business as opposed to someone approaching you to buy your business, you're never going to get the value out of it. in the same way.
Yeah.
So it's just, I just think you're bringing up something there that I want people to think about a little bit, and certainly something, you know, that clearly you know about, I know about, but I think a lot of people starting businesses aren't aware, and so it's good to talk about it. So thanks for sharing on that. I'm interested in your view on this question I ask all my guests, which is, do you think entrepreneurs are born or bred?
Yeah. So that's, I suppose, nature versus nurture type of thing, right? I suppose the short answer is, like, I don't know, and I think it's sort of it is impossible to sort of tell one way or the other. Like, I know some founders that are absolutely incredible in terms of, you know, this ability to go out and hustle, you know, and meet customers and meet investors and sell this sort of big picture thing. And I do think, to an extent, that is maybe not born, but certainly learned at a very early age, and maybe it comes down to a confidence thing. But I do think, you know, given the right circumstances, I think maybe people who are not naturally predisposed to being a founder, under the right circumstances, they can sort of be dragged kicking and screaming to become a founder, to become an entrepreneur. And to an extent, I think that's, you know, what I've experienced, right? So I'm not, you know, I'm not the type of person that is massively overconfident in what I'm doing or what I'm building, but I know that what I'm doing could potentially make a difference to our customers. And one of the things that, you know, we talk about quite a bit here, we've some brilliant state-sponsored supports, right? So we've Enterprise Ireland and a few other groups. So if you have an idea and maybe you sit more on the technical side of things, Enterprise Ireland and whoever else will literally sit you down and sort of say, right, well, here's what you need to do to start turning this from an idea or a technology into a business. And I do think, you know, I'd hate to think that there are people out there with really good ideas who aren't doing them because they don't have, they feel they don't have the skill set to be an entrepreneur, or to be, and I do think, like, there definitely are people who can go out there and just, you know, build a business and sell and sell and sell. But I also think there's people out there who are as capable of doing that. They just need the hand holding, so to speak, and they sort of need to learn it. And I do think it can be learned quite effectively.
Again, you're highlighting something that I want the audience to pick up on. I mean, I'm actually a hustler style of entrepreneur, but I do think it's just one style. And actually, you can hire people like me if that's not what you have as a skill. So, you know, I've seen accountants who are founders of companies, for example. And, you know, we all know plenty of programmers like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, that have started businesses and were not necessarily business people as such in the classic sense. So yeah, I agree with you. I also want to highlight Enterprise Ireland and actually the Irish ecosystem and how well it's doing. So if anyone's thinking of doing a startup, Ireland is not a bad place to start a company. And I know that you're kind of held up as one of the success stories in Ireland, right? But you're on the spot, but that's what I see.
Yeah, like, look, I think realistically, you know, Enterprise Ireland here especially, they do an incredibly good job of shouting about local companies, you know, and they sort of have an expertise. I know that it's sort of the soft touch diplomacy that Ireland tends to be very good at. And I actually think there's an article in The Economist in the last couple of weeks about how Ireland consistently hits above its weight in terms of diplomatic affairs and things like that. But one of the things that we tend to be quite good at is leaning into this idea of, you know, that we are this small, very open island nation, and we should shout about our accomplishments a bit more from a business standpoint. Like, we have, like, the example that is usually, you know, thrown up there is the likes of Stripe and Intercom and some of those guys that essentially were born, and the idea of the genesis of what they were doing grew out of Ireland and internationally. And it is, there's a lot of companies even in the Enterprise Ireland sort of cohort that I would know, and that are doing absolutely incredible things. And it is the Irish ecosystem seems to know intrinsically when to shout about someone, and when to talk about them and build them up, and at the same time when to know, well, let them put the head down and just work. And I do think that's something that is massively important, and it tends to get washed away sometimes. That you can get a lot of this as a startup, as a founder, as whatever. It's relatively easy to get PR, right? Whether it's in Ireland, the UK, or the US, there's always a tech journalist who wants to write about the next thing. But I do think it is very easy for founders, and again, not just tech founders, but founders in general, to get sort of swept along with that. And nearly measuring success in terms of, well, how many articles have we been written into in the last number of weeks or months or whatever. But yeah, like I think the ecosystem here and Enterprise Ireland sort of know when to push the accelerator and when to sort of allow companies to sit back, and when to let them put their head down and just work. And you see that a lot in the medtech space. A lot of incredible medtech companies based in Ireland who are, doing absolutely, life-changing things for people, and you never heard of them because they're just, have a staff of 10. They're doing some high-end research, and they just need to keep their head down and work. Like, they don't need, TechCrunch talking about them, because they have 2 customers in the entire world, like it might be Pfizer and someone else. But it is that knowing when to sort of put the head down and work, and knowing when to stick your head above the parapets and sort of say, hey, look at me, we're trying to sell, or we're trying to raise, or whatever.
It's interesting. I do think that certain markets, countries themselves, do better PR than others on kind of highlighting what they're able to do. I mean, of course, Silicon Valley is the most famous of them all, and in a way, that whole concept of what happens when you go to Silicon Valley attracts a lot of people with that mindset too. So it's self-fulfilling, isn't it? And I know a lot of great companies coming out of Ireland, but it does still feel like everyone's battling against Silicon Valley. I wondered, Daniel, your education and how that played a part in your development. I feel like, for example, in England, there's still very much a culture of educating people to not take risk, and it's all about getting good grades and those sorts of things. What's the education system like in Ireland? Does it encourage entrepreneurship, or do you feel it's got a similar problem to England?
I think it's doing better than it was. Like at the moment, there is in secondary schools here, there's a lot of focus on entrepreneurial type competitions and things like that. So like build a business competitions, and I think there's even a build a bank competition as well. But I do think it was never propositioned as a career choice, right? It was never, oh, you can go to college, do a degree and then start your own business. It was sort of go to college, get a degree and sort of work for someone else, and then maybe the light bulb moment and you do something else. I do think here we're getting a little bit better at putting a greater emphasis on the idea that yes, you can go out and start a business, and in a lot of cases there's people now starting businesses while they're still in high school and secondary school, which is really incredible to see. Like about 2 or 3 years ago, I was asked to judge a business plan competition from a grouping of local secondary schools, and some of these businesses were at the time making more money than I was, selling wallets and selling headbands and things like that. So it's definitely beginning to be a better I suppose a better focus on the career choice, for lack of a better word, of being an entrepreneur. But a lot more could be done to not only to encourage that, but also to provide a better safety net to allow people to actually do that. At least here anyway.
And the idea side's interesting as well. Like a lot of people I know who want to start businesses feel like they don't have the best idea or the kind of the next big idea yet, so they haven't started. How did you come about doing UrbanFox? And I know you pivoted, so I was reading about your history, but tell us how that played out.
Yeah, so I had UrbanFox, I always say, is my third startup. It was probably fourth or fifth when you actually break it down. So I'd just come off the back of a previous startup where I'd co-founded it. And that was, it was three co-founders, and we built a business. And that's what we kept telling ourselves, we built a business. And in reality, we built sort of a chaos engine. We raised some money, and we hired people. And I think at one point we had 8 or 9 people working for us, and we hadn't a clue what to get them to do. It was essentially organized chaos. And then by the time we thought we had a customer for a product that barely worked, in an industry that really didn't want to buy technology products, we realized that the customers we had lined up were basically, it was essentially a duopoly. There was 2 massive companies that were in control of all these sort of sub industries and sub businesses, and we realized, like, we're never going to be able to sell to them. It'll be a 2 or 3 year sales cycle, and they're just colossal. So around the same time, I was thinking quite a lot about, there was a lot of really cool tools coming on the market around machine learning and things like that, and predictive analytics, and it was stuff that 2 years previous would only have been in universities and high-end research organizations, and now it was available for free as an open source library. So I had this idea at the time, which was, could you use predictive analytics, some machine learning, and sort of economic monitoring to build a tool to push notifications to customers of like physical retail, like Tesco or whoever else. So to sort of the right message to the right customer at the right time, but make that message so targeted that there was a 85% plus chance that they'd actually go and could buy a product. And that was intellectually is a really interesting concept, because you were looking at elasticity and propensity to spend and economic capability and all of that type of thing. And then when I went to actually try and sell it, no one was interested. And then at the same time, Apple sort of came out and said, oh, our new push notification API sort of does all of that anyway, and it's free. So that really obviously didn't work out, but the core nuts and bolts of what I had was fairly interesting. This idea of using machine learning and economic analysis and pattern analysis. And around the same time, I was introduced to an individual based in Silicon Valley who sort of had been there, done that. So he had built one of the original Know Your Customer software solutions in the 90s, brought it onto the NASDAQ, sold it to an institution for many multiples of billions of dollars. So he'd sort of been there, he'd gone through the entire life cycle. And I had a coffee with him in San Jose, and it was essentially one of those conversations where I wouldn't have arrived at the suggestion he made on my own, or certainly it would have taken a significant amount of time, and it was fraud. And I spent the next probably 6 months doing an incredibly deep dive into who fraudsters are, how they operate, all of that type of thing. Like in the pitch to Techstars or whoever else, it's always a nice moment when I put up the slide and sort of say, oh, well, we not only understand the victims of fraud, but we understand the fraudsters themselves because we've actually met them, and we have. And it was an incredibly deep dive into this area of basically how bad guys are ripping us all off and all of that type of thing. And we were playing around with that idea and building it, and the Irish government sort of said, well, we'd be interested in investing in deep tech, and then obviously Techstars then came along, and once sort of a bank So Techstars is linked with Barclays in the UK, and the Barclays Techstars Accelerator. And it was just like, I have now access to these incredible people, banking experts, startup experts, growth experts, investors, a who's who of who in a way. And it was just this constant validation. So I could say to Andy, one of our advisors, do you think this would work? And, within a couple of hours, he would come back to me, with a fraud expert from Barclays or whoever else. And it was just this constant validation cycle. And it was sort of at that moment I sort of realized, right, we're actually onto something here. More so than any other startup I'd actually been involved in. And what was actually quite nice, and I think it was the moment where I knew I'm sort of doing the right things here, is when I started making the software smaller. So it was actually doing less and less and less, removing features and removing APIs, and it just became this super neat little piece of software. And I was nearly going to customers and saying, hey, I was talking about this huge thing 2 or 3 months ago, but now it's just this really minute thing that does a very, very specific job. And the feedback on that was absolutely phenomenal. And again, that was very much a sort of Techstars, talk more, build less. So talk to as many people as you can, and sort of, because again, as techies, we love to build stuff, even though we're not getting the right validation on that stuff. And we love to hear feedback on that stuff and selectively edit it down to what we want to hear. But that's sort of been my journey up till now, and sort of the conversations of how I've sort of gotten here and built what I have.
Fascinating. I like this concept a lot of like talk more, build less. And I know, a quick shout out Techstars, the folks in London, for introducing us. So thank you to them. But I know, often people that are thinking of building businesses, there is this tendency. I mean, most people have read the Lean Startup by now, and the minimum viable product piece, but people still tend to want to build more features for people. Or at least have the option to give people more features. It's interesting that you went back the other way, and did that feel risky at the time?
Yeah, that was sort of terrifying, because all along you have this assumption that my business does X, and now I have to validate with people who are experts in that field that if I go and spend the next year of my life and investment money and capital on this, is that going to be a worthwhile proposition? Sort of weighing up the idea of risk and reward and that type of thing. But realistically, I suppose it very much took me out of my comfort zone, because I'm sort of just as happy to fire off an email to someone to say, hey, here's our demo video, or here's a demo clip of what we're doing. What do you think? Only to realize after it's sort of being repeatedly told to me that, no, you need to sit down in front of people, you need to talk to them, and you need to figure out a way to keep them honest. And as much as possible, you need to stop talking about what you're building. Don't tell them don't give them much detail about what you're building. Just get them to talk, and get them to talk about what their problems are, and how they're solving their problems at the moment. And some of the conversations I had are, especially in the early days, like the first couple of weeks on Techstars, were those conversations. I was going back to the hotel thinking, I've made a horrible mistake. This is twisting the business in a way that I'm not particularly comfortable with. And it did take a while, because you sort of what we were going back to earlier, you're sort of tied to this business and this idea and this concept. When realistically, especially at the earlier stages, it might be better to be dispassionate about it. So if you do get pulled in a way, you can sort of research that in an unbiased way.
I think that's a very interesting point. Basically, you're saying of course, people feel they need to be passionate about their businesses, but what you're talking about there, for your experience, is that sometimes you've also got to be able to take a step back, I guess, take some criticism, some feedback, and even try to apply a new direction, which isn't that easy when you're in the mid flow, right? Or you've got your opinion. I think a lot of people can relate to that problem. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners right now who are building businesses, and people have told them to do less, and they have this instinct, and it's I've had it myself. I think where you feel like, well, if I build more chances that customers will want one piece of what I built. Whereas if I build one thing, then I'm limiting myself and the people that will want that one thing, right?
Yeah.
But actually, in reality, you end up being very focused. I mean, I say a lot about people starting businesses. I would say, don't do many things in your business. Focus on one thing, make it work, do it well, and then once that's working and doing well, you can scale up into everything else, right? I mean, it feels like a very similar lesson you're highlighting there.
Yeah, like that's again with us, that was definitely the case, because I remember when I was sitting down to sketch out what UrbanFox would do and how it would do it, there was just this litany of features. And in my mind, I'd sort of convinced myself that, oh no, these aren't all like 20 different features. This is like one feature, but these are all the 20 different selling points for that feature. And realistically, I could raise $20 million and still not build those 20 features. And not only that, what I found, and again, I'm not a salesperson by any stretch of the imagination, but if you went into, when I would go in to talk to, fraud teams in banks or in merchants, and you start talking about 20 different features, the feedback you get is just so scattered, because every person in that room will like one feature more than another because it solves a highly particular problem to them, but it doesn't solve the overarching focus of what they should be doing. I have notebooks of notes where I met different teams and sort of said, look, this is all UrbanFox does. What do you think? Where I whittled it down to one or two main features, and the feedback was just so much more useful than sort of this scattergun approach that we took earlier on when we had 20 or 30 different features. And I think, and I'm not sure is this more of a fintech thing, but in the fintech space, you tend to get people who are very, very focused on one particular job within a bank or wherever, whether it's money laundering or that type of thing. And when you sort of resonate with what they're doing, you tend to get this, very honest feedback. Like I distinctly remember having a conversation with a head of fraud for a large UK retailer, and we were talking about the highly intricate type of fraud, and he just made a really interesting point where he said his biggest issue wasn't actually detecting fraud or finding fraud, which was a bit of a bummer for me, because that's what I was trying to sell him, right? It was essentially he had no way to monitor his team and to sort of see, well, who is doing better than someone else and who is performing better. Whereas, I could have spent 6 months trying to sell him UrbanFox and sort of saying, oh, well, we can tack on a performance management tool. But I think those sort of conversations, and I think there's a bit of psychology to it as well. It's sort of like the hard hat approach. So like if you're talking to customers really early and you make them feel like they're part of the building process, like you're showing them the nuts and bolts and you have to put on your high-vis jacket and your hard hat or whatever, they feel a bit more invested in it. At least that's been certainly my experience. That they sort of see, oh, well, UrbanFox was at this stage 6 months ago or 3 months ago. Oh, now they're here and I've gotten this nice newsletter or whatever it might be from them. But that idea of just talking and listening as much as you can through all the stages, right? So, I'd always assumed the sales process would be very much me talking to them and me delivering information to them, and then they would go away and make a decision. But what I'm slowly learning is, no, it's basically I just prime them with the information, and they sort of come back to me, and I sort of listen to their 9 times out of 10 it's their demands or whatever. But it's that idea of stop building, and at the end of the day, unfortunately, the whole thing of having a cool new piece of technology that uses all the important buzzwords, is only skin deep. Once you start actually selling the product, they generally don't care. It could be the most sophisticated AI engine in the world, or it could be 100 monkeys on 100 typewriters. Like, they don't care as long as it delivers results. And I think as technology people, we have to try and separate ourselves from that pretty early on.
I have to say, you sound like a very good salesperson to me. I mean, basically what you're talking about there is listening to clients. So many people go in there and start selling what they've got. But it's a delicate balance, isn't it? Because of course, like you're saying, what you could have easily done when that client gave you feedback that they needed this monitoring item for their staff, you could have pivoted into that, and that actually could have become a very successful business on its own, a separate business. But it wasn't what you did, it wasn't what you had. So it's interesting. Again, I always think about the listeners, how they might leverage that insight. That what's the balance between like listening to client feedback and adapting your business to be what they need, or just realizing you've asked the wrong question of the wrong client and to kind of move on to the next one that actually will need what you've got to buy or sell.
Yeah, and huge. Like, again, one of these like early learning points was we had plugging Techstars. We had one of their advisors sit down with me to review who I was talking to in different companies, because I sort of thought going on to Techstars that I had, I was a little bit further ahead with the customer validation piece, and I very quickly realized that it's easy to talk to potential customers, or potential customers at the early stage and customers at the later stage, but what's actually quite difficult is actually talking to the right ones. Obviously it took me quite a while to realize that in a lot of corporates it's actually really easy to get meetings with quite senior people, because they love bringing in the sort of startup petting zoo every now and again. Like, bringing in a company doing AI and you'll have 20 different people, and it makes you feel great about yourself because you're in a room with 20 interested people. But then you realize like none of these people are actually, whether they want to or not, none of them are actually in a position to push you along the journey within that company. And I do think, even going back to the born or bred sort of thing, that is something that in terms of Startup 101 should be taught very, very early on. That you can talk to all of these companies and you can have really good meetings with them, but unless you're talking to the right people in those companies, it's a futile effort. And to spend the time figuring out, is it the head of fraud I need to talk to, or is it head of AML, or is it head of security, or where does that lie? And again, it's something that I suppose realistically it's worth putting the time and effort into, going from, again, like the features, it's going from having 100 meetings in a month that are okay to having 2 or 3 meetings that are absolutely 100% on target.
Did you do that in the early days of the business? Did you talk to clients, or did you just see a gap in the market and fill it and then go talk to customers?
Yeah, so with the previous business we just built a product, and we thought, oh yes, people will like this. I suppose one of the founders was sort of in that space, and we were sort of relying on his feedback quite a lot, and we started building, and then we sort of went back to customers and revalidated and started rebuilding, and that went on for months. And I remember when I started at UrbanFox, I was thinking, like, I never want to be in that position again, because it just takes too much effort. So with UrbanFox, after the pivot and when we became more interested in fraud, we sort of knew there was that gap in the market to detect a very particular type of fraud. Now, hindsight is a great thing. I did spend quite a lot of time building and assuming, yes, this will work for our potential customers, and it's sort of a binary thing. We had there was quite a few competitors in the marketplace where we could where we could see, well, these customers are also, or these competitors are also doing it, so why not us? Our technology is better. We know it's better because of X, Y, and Z. So we sort of got to a point, and then it was, very much we had to go back nearly to square one a little bit in terms of, okay, well, we thought that the issue was here in sort of the customer flow in terms of fraud detection, but it was actually a much more nuanced problem. But only after sort of talking to those customers, we realized that, oh, well, actually, it's the problem really starts at this point of the customer journey, not at the point where everyone else seems to assume it does. And again, it's that sort of like, I suppose, again, hindsight's a great thing, but it's that idea of going back, and I suppose feeling safe to go back and validate. So I was lucky enough that I had a couple of early stage, even from the pre-pivot UrbanFox, when we were a customer analytics tool. I had a couple of people in the industry I could go back and talk to sort of say, hey, I'm thinking about pivoting into fraud. Can you tell me everything you know about fraud? So those sort of initial warm introductions. And I do think it's a perfectly valid case where you essentially look at competitors and justify the gap or justify the market by saying, well, there's 3 or 4 other companies doing this. We in theory do it better. So why not us too? Like not every startup is going to be building some incredibly unique solution.
I think you make a very interesting point there. I always want to make sure the listeners pick up on it, because we are having a bit of a lag on technology, so I don't want people to not hear what you just said there. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is that if you're trying to validate a business, of course, you can have an idea yourself, but going out there and talking to customers is one thing. It is an interesting point to also suggest that you look at your competition. I hate to keep using them as an example because I'm not a big fan, but I guess Facebook probably used MySpace as a reference point to show that 600 billion people have gone online and are sharing content daily. Why not us if we build a better platform? I think that validation via competition is a pretty interesting thing that not everybody thinks about. Actually, I think often people just see as competition. These are the reasons we're going to beat them, as opposed to using them as a way of validating what you're building.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I guess just bringing it back to my, some of my standard questions of the guests. I'm interested in whether you feel luck plays a role in your business, and how has it played a role, good or bad luck?
Yeah. So I'm not a huge believer in luck in general. I think we can engineer our own luck to an extent, but looking back at it, sort of unbiased, yeah, there's definitely been a few moments where, and again, not to overplug Techstars, but having the MD of Techstars sort of having the MD of Techstars reach out to me essentially randomly, and to keep bugging me for weeks and weeks and weeks, sending me emails and calling me. And I've said this before, but like Kartik, who runs the program in London, he obviously has the patience of an absolute saint to deal with me. I think he sort of, up to a day or two before the deadline to accept your place on Techstars, I was still uncertain, and I distinctly remember signing up in sort of a very Irish way, in terms of, oh sure, I might as well. There was very little rhyme or reason behind it. I just sort of thought, what is there to lose? But what freaks me out a little bit is looking back on it and how unbelievably close I came to saying, like, thanks but no thanks, because that was, obviously to lose out on that, and all that has happened during it would have been a massive mistake. So in terms of that is probably in terms of good luck intersecting with maybe some bad luck. And look, in terms of strictly on the bad luck side, with the previous startup, that was, certainly in the last 3 months of the company's existence, it was just one bad thing after another. People leaving the company with absolutely good reason because we basically couldn't pay them, running out of money because we had no customers. There was this constant flow of little bad things that kept happening, but it did sort of, the amount of stuff that I learned from that bad stuff happening, I think if I didn't learn it, or if the previous company came to a more stuttering end, I wouldn't have picked up on it, and it would probably have been very different in terms of, I possibly would have just gone out and joined a corporate or whatever it might be. But I think there's, I don't know, to sound cheesy, I suppose luck is what you make of it, right? So bad luck can be reframed as good luck. Good luck, I suppose, can be reframed as bad luck. But that defining moment where I came down to the wire with Techstars, and essentially randomly decided to join. Even looking back on it now, it's still, I sort of think like how unbelievably lucky it was that I actually decided, yeah, sure, I'll do it, because I wouldn't be here at all talking to you, certainly, or anyone else about UrbanFox if I hadn't said yes, and definitely. And then it is engineered luck after that. So Techstars have this mentality of sort of being in the room and being present, which, to be honest, I sort of thought was a marketing BS a little bit, but being in their office in Rise in London, where one day some senior executive from some tech company has come in for a visit or to look around, and all of a sudden you're being introduced to this person who, if you sat at home, working away on your own, would never have happened. So there's that idea as well of engineered luck, which I'm sort of a big believer in.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I think a lot of the time people do wonder why they don't get lucky, but they didn't put themselves out there. Equally, you had to say yes, and as you say, sure, I'll give it a go. So I totally understand. I feel like I only have you for an hour, so I think we're running short on time already. We've got a little bit of a technical lag as well, so I worry about the quality of the broadcast today. But I wanted to get to one final question, I guess, with you. Well, two, I guess. One is, do you feel your education helped you or hindered you in any way? And what your view is on education generally today? And then if you went back to your younger self and gave some advice just to wrap up the podcast, what would it be?
Oh, wow. Okay. So definitely on the education part, in terms of my ability as a software developer, data scientist, I did not learn that in college. I'm essentially self-taught. We did quite a lot of coding in college, but it wasn't particularly heavy duty or anything like that. There is this debate right now, and definitely more so in COVID times, in terms of being self-taught. And I definitely think there is 100% a place for that, in terms of someone deciding, I want to learn how to code or whatever, but I do think that college or university or even school education does provide a level of rigor, level of critical rigor to what someone is doing, and I always think of this. So when I'm working on a coding project, and I'm having an issue, and I show it to a friend of mine who did computer science in college or whatever it might be, you can see the sort of thought rigor around CS that he might have or she might have, and how they apply it to my project, which is more, I just want to build this thing, whether it's a plugin for Google Home or whatever it is, and they can apply more of a methodology based solution to it, if that makes sense. So yeah, it is education. Yeah, it did play a reasonably large part in getting me to where I am right now. But I think it's more on the rigor side of things, and And again, like, I left college in the middle of the last recession, which basically meant there was no jobs, and I sort of had to join a startup, because at the time it was like there were no real jobs, so go and work with a startup. So I suppose it put me on a trajectory that I'm on right now. In terms of the advice that I would give myself when I was younger, I think we're a product of our decisions. But I suppose one of the things that, and we've talked about in the last hour, but it's that idea of putting yourself out there a little bit more. Like, you never know where the next little conversation might lead on to. There's no point in, I suppose, maybe say yes more often to sort of introductions and things like that, and don't just assume that because person X doesn't have a title or a credential that is immediately appealing to you or relevant to you, that they don't have something beneficial to add, right? So it could be a secondary introduction, or it could be an idea, or whatever it is. But I think that's critically important, right? And it's just to have those conversations with people and to get sort of a wealth of experience into what you're doing.
Yeah, I think a wonderful bit of advice at the end there. And my translation is that I also, in my career, at one point when I lived in Hong Kong, I was having 12 meetings a day, and someone said to me, "Isn't this a complete waste of your time?" I said, "Yes, 6 of them are. I just don't know which 6." And I think that's part of it. Sometimes on paper you think you're going to have a meeting, it's going to be the perfect meeting, and then the one you think is a waste of time, and they completely switch. And you don't ever know until it happens. So, but I wanted to talk more about your experiences in accelerators. I wanted to ask you more about what it's like to meet fraudsters and what they look like. I have this image in my mind of these really evil people sitting in a dark room doing sinister things. But in the fact that you've met them, I wanted to ask more about that. I wanted to ask more about the ecosystem in Ireland, but I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I have to have you back, Daniel. I'm going to talk all about those things. And yeah, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to sum up what I've taken away from today. I like the concept you said at the beginning of the podcast about building a name as a measure of success. I mean, I put it in the frame of like build a brand, not a business. I think that's really interesting as a measure of success, building a brand that you're proud of, that people want to interact with and work with and work for, and so on. I always like your Irish saying, as you put it. Oh, sure, I might as well. I think that kind of links back to your sum up just a moment ago about what you'd say to your younger self. I think that's actually a really good saying. I like the point you mentioned about focus. I think a lot of people get confused about this bit of advice about you should focus. And I do think that's worth considering. Are you focusing or not, and what are you focusing on? You might be focusing on one brand, and within that brand 12 solutions, but that alone will not make you successful. Focusing on the focus. Actually, it's a theme within my podcast that comes up quite a lot, and I think it's worth reminding people what you talked about there. The focus piece is so important. This is my translation of what you said, but not everyone is a hustler. So there's plenty of people out there that can be entrepreneurs. There's not just one type of entrepreneur. You are actually a good example of that. You don't describe yourself as a salesperson, but in my view, you've learnt sales, at least the psychology side of it. And I think I like this whole concept of the no real jobs. So start a startup. I think we should make a T-shirt out of that with your name on it, because that's, I actually think that's something right now very relevant for a lot of people. It's sometimes good to have a recession, because it can make you rethink what it is you're actually meant to be doing. And so, especially where smart people like you, Daniel, I'm sure you could have got a job every day of the week. And so in a way, maybe for our security, we're lucky that you didn't. So we're lucky you're doing UrbanFox and protecting us all today. So I like the whole concept of less is more. It's a startup mantra you do hear a lot, but I think a lot of people don't understand it. So thanks for taking the time to explain it today. And that links back to that kind of talk more, build less, which actually is the opposite to what you often hear. It's build more, talk less. But I like the idea you've switched it, and I do think people should take note that talking more about what you're doing but building less is pretty interesting. And actually, I know it's come from Techstars too, so it doesn't surprise me. Pretty wise advice. So keep engineering your luck, Daniel. And thank you so much for your time today.
Great. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Good Luck Club podcast. We know you have thousands of podcasts you could be listening to, and you choose to listen to us. If you found Daniel's insights useful today, please give us a comment or click through to Daniel's site and let him know what you think of his business. We hope every week that you learn a few things from the founders that share their stories. I myself as the host always do. And we look forward to seeing you next week.